All right, so welcome to another deep dive with us. This time we're going to be looking at the case of Awatchi Oyola. She was a member of the Seminole tribe and was found dead in her apartment back in 2013 in Norman, Oklahoma.
And on the surface, it kind of seems like a robbery gone wrong. But when you look a little bit deeper, you start to see that things aren't quite as clear as they might seem.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at a bunch of different sources for this case. Things like police interviews, witness statements. We even have some surveillance footage. And then there's this really strange autopsy report that just kind of throws a wrench in the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the real turning point in this story, but we'll get to that a little bit later.
So to set the stage for our listeners, it's September 25th, 2013. Awatchi's friends, they hadn't heard from her in a while, and they start to get worried. So they go over to her apartment to check on her.
And right away, things are not right. The door to the apartment had been kicked in, the whole place was ransacked, and then when they go upstairs, they find Awatchi. She's dead.
Yeah, and in all this chaos, her 5-year-old daughter is nowhere to be found. I mean, can you imagine? That just adds another layer to this whole tragedy.
It's awful. Thankfully, though, they found her daughter safe with her father. He had a solid alibi, so that was at least one less thing to worry about.
Okay, so back at the apartment, investigators are going through everything and trying to figure out what happened. But things get a little complicated.
Well, yeah, I mean, there were valuables missing from the apartment, her purse, her phone, even her debit card, all gone. But her car was still there. It's just weird. It doesn't really add up like a normal robbery.
Right, and then there's this text message sent from Awatchi's phone the morning she was found.
This is where things get a little wild.
The message mentions this guy named Moose. So initially, the police think, okay, maybe this is a jealous ex-boyfriend or something like that.
Yeah, it seems pretty straightforward, right?
But then they track down this Moose character, and it turns out he's got a rock-solid alibi.
And to make things even weirder, the text wasn't even sent from Awatchi's apartment.
So, all right, Moose is out of the picture. Who are the police looking at next?
Well, this is where the investigation starts to focus in on a guy known as Cocaine Rob. Real name, Rob Ross. He was Awatchi's drug dealer, and it doesn't take long for him to become the prime suspect.
So what makes them zero in on this guy specifically?
They start going through Awatchi's cell phone records, and they find a ton of calls and texts between her and Rob in the days leading up to her death. And then there are these ATM withdrawals.
What do you mean ATM withdrawals?
So the day before she was found, Awatchi takes out $500 from an ATM at a gas station. Then, the morning she's found, another $500 gets taken out, this time from an ATM at a casino.
Okay, and what does that have to do with Rob?
They pull the security footage from the casino, and guess who they see using Awatchi's card that morning?
I'm guessing Cocaine Rob.
Bingo! And it gets even better. He's with another woman at the casino, and she tells the police that she drove him to Awatchi's apartment complex that same morning. She waited in the car for him. But when he finally comes out and calls her to come get him, she says he's acting really strange.
Strange how?
Like he's sweating, really nervous, almost like he's trying to get out of there as fast as he can.
Okay, so we've got him at the casino using her debit card, and now we've got him at her apartment the same day she's found dead.
Did the police bring him in for questioning?
Oh yeah, they definitely brought him in, and let me tell you, his story was all over the place.
What do you mean?
At first he denies everything, but then he changes his story and says that, yeah, he was at Awatchi's apartment that morning, says they had sex, that it was consensual, and that she lent him her debit card because she owed him money.
Okay, but if everything was consensual, why was he acting so sketchy when his friend picked him up?
Exactly. The police weren't buying it for a second. They thought he was trying to cover something up.
So, do they arrest him? What happens next? Well, this is where things get really interesting. The autopsy report comes back, and let's just say it throws everything they thought they knew out the window. So before the break, we were talking about how Rob's story just didn't really add up.
Yeah, it seemed like the police were pretty sure he was hiding something.
Right, and then they get the autopsy report back, and it kind of throws a wrench into the whole investigation.
Okay, so what did the medical examiner find?
Well, they found injuries on the back of Awatchi's neck, and they said these were consistent with strangulation.
Strangulation, so it sounds like somebody killed her.
You would think so, right? But here's the thing. They listed the cause of death as undetermined.
Hold on. They're saying it looks like she was strangled, but they can't say for sure how she died. I don't get it.
It's a little confusing. Basically, you got to understand the difference between the cause of death and the manner of death. The cause is like the actual thing that killed the person, like a disease or an injury. And in this case, yeah, it could have been strangulation.
Right. Okay, if I'm so far.
But the manner of death, that's more of a big picture category. Like, was it natural causes? Was it an accident? Was it suicide? Was it a homicide? Or is it just, we don't know?
So they're saying they don't know the manner of death, even though it looks like she might have been murdered.
Exactly. And that created a huge problem for the prosecution.
How so?
Well, think about it. You've got this suspect, you've got a possible motive, you've got a witness placing him at the scene, but you don't have a clear homicide ruling. So the DA was really hesitant to file charges against Rob without that.
Wow, I can't imagine how frustrating that must have been for Awatchi's family.
Oh, it was devastating. They want justice for Awatchi, but the system's basically saying, well, we can't really say for sure what happened, so.
That's awful.
It really shows you how much power a single medical examiner's opinion can have, even when it doesn't seem to line up with the rest of the evidence.
So what happened? Did the case just go cold?
For a while, yeah.
Yeah.
But Detective Karks, he wasn't ready to give up.
Oh, good.
So he keeps working on the case, reviewing the evidence.
What's he looking for at this point?
Anything at all that could help move the case forward.
I see.
And then in 2019, he decides to get a second opinion on the autopsy.
A second opinion. Interesting.
Yeah, he reaches out to the Armed Forces Medical Examiner's Office in Maryland. They agree to take a look at the case files.
Okay, and what do they say?
Well, their conclusion was totally different. They ruled Awatchi's death a homicide.
Wow, that's a big deal. So what, did they find something that the original medical examiner missed?
Not really. It was more about how they interpreted the existing evidence. They agreed that the specific way she was killed, like the exact method, might be unknown.
Okay.
But they said that the circumstances surrounding her death, all the evidence taken together, it clearly pointed to homicide.
So finally, they have the homicide ruling. I imagine the DA is ready to file charges now, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But believe it or not, the DA still refused to file charges. They said they had this policy of always working with the state medical examiner's office. Basically, they were prioritizing procedure over, well, what seemed like clear evidence of a crime.
I can't believe that. So all this, the second autopsy, the homicide ruling, it didn't make a difference?
Unfortunately not. Awatchi's family was right back where they started.
This is just heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's a really tough situation. I mean, you've got this seemingly solved case, but it's still unresolved. It really makes you question the system, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder if Awatchi's heritage, the fact that she was Native American, if that played a role in how this case was handled.
It's a valid question, and it's one that we can't ignore.
Yeah, we need to talk about these things, bring them to light.
For sure. This case is a reminder that these issues exist, and we can't just pretend they don't.
Man, this case is just, I don't know, it's hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack.
I mean, we're left with so many questions.
Right, and that's kind of the thing with this case. It really makes you think about how things can go wrong, how people can fall through the cracks, you know? Even with a system that's supposed to protect them.
Especially with that whole DA thing. I still can't believe they wouldn't prosecute.
It's tough to understand, for sure.
And it just makes you wonder if there were other factors at play.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, off being Native American, I mean. Do you think that had anything to do with how this whole thing was handled?
I think it's a question we have to ask. You know, historically, Native American communities haven't always been treated fairly by the justice system.
And then there's the whole forensic science aspect of it.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It's just crazy how two medical examiners could look at the same evidence and come to such different conclusions.
It shows you that even forensic science isn't perfect.
Like it's not always black and white.
Exactly. There's always going to be some level of interpretation involved.
And in this case, that interpretation, it had huge consequences.
Right, and it makes you wonder how often that happens. How many other cases are out there where the evidence might be flawed or misinterpreted?
That's a scary thought.
It is.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from Awatchi's case?
Well, I think it's a wake-up call, you know? We need to be pushing for reform in the justice system, make sure it's actually serving everyone.
Yeah, and we need to be paying attention to these kinds of cases, especially when they involve marginalized communities.
Absolutely. We can't let these stories be silenced.
Awatchi deserved justice. And even though we can't bring her back, we can make sure her story is heard.
Right, and hopefully it can spark some real change.
So for our listeners out there, if you're feeling as outraged by this case as we are, remember that you're not alone, and we can all do something to make a difference.
Even just talking about it, sharing Awatchi's story, that's a start.
We'll be sure to include some resources in the show notes, places where you can learn more about missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Yeah, and if you have any information about the case, even if you think it's insignificant, please reach out to the Norman Police Department.
You never know what could be the missing piece of the puzzle.
Every little bit helps.
Awatchi's family, they deserve answers.
And we can all play a part in making sure those responsible are held accountable.
This has been a really tough deep dive, I'm not going to lie.
It has.
But it's so important to talk about these things.
Absolutely.
We can't let these stories be forgotten.
So thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope it's inspired you to learn more, to think critically, and to stay engaged in the fight for justice.
And for Awatchi, and for all the other victims out there, let's keep fighting for a more just world. A world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, and where everyone has access to a fair and equitable system. Thanks again for listening.